The Galactic Council chamber floated between the stars like a giant crystal palace, and inside its walls, 47 different species gathered to talk about peace and trade and all the things that kept the galaxy from tearing itself apart with. War and Daniel Harper stood at the human platform watching Ambassador Velthorn of the Crithian. An Empire gave his quarterly report and something felt wrong about today's meeting, but Daniel couldn't quite figure out what it was yet. And beside him, his aide Lisa Monroe tapped quietly on her tablet while the alien ambassador's clicking language got translated into smooth human words through the chamber systems, and Daniel had been doing this job for 15 years now, and he knew when someone was about to drop bad news on the council floor, and Velthorn was definitely building up to something big. The Crithian ambassador talked about trade numbers and border agreements and mining rights in the outer territories, and his insect-like body shifted colors slightly as he spoke, which Daniel had learned meant the creature was either nervous or excited, and Daniel was betting on excited, which made his stomach tighten with worry. And then Velthorn said the words that would change everything, in the entire chamber went silent like someone had sucked all the air out of the room, and Daniel felt his blood turn cold in his veins. Velthorn announced that Crithian forces had secured the human colony of New Haven, and he used that word secured like it was some kind of legal transaction and not an invasion, in Daniel's mind. Immediately went to the 43,000 people who lived on that colony, and the families and children and scientists who had spent 20 years turning a dead rock into a living world. And Velthorn kept talking about ancient territorial claims and rights under old treaties, and Daniel wanted to reach across the chamber and strangle the insect right there in front of everyone. Daniel's voice cut through the shocked silence, and he demanded clarification, and he didn't bother with diplomatic language anymore, because there was nothing diplomatic about invading a civilian colony, and Velthorn turned his multifaceted eyes toward the human delegation and explained in that same calm voice that the colonists had been relocated to processing facilities, and Daniel knew exactly what that meant because he had studied the Crithians for years, and processing facilities was their polite term for slave camps, and the anger that had been building in his chest suddenly exploded into something he could barely control. The chamber erupted with delegates shouting, and the council arbiter tried to restore order, but Daniel ignored all of it, and he asked the only question that mattered, which was whether the colonists were still alive. And Velthorn tilted his head and said that the ones who cooperated were alive, and the ones who resisted had been dealt with according to military protocol, and something inside Daniel broke right then. He realized that 15 years of diplomatic training and all his careful words and patient negotiations had been for nothing, because some species only understood violence. Daniel told Velthorn that he had declared war on humanity, and the Crithian ambassador actually seemed amused by this. And he explained that no war had been declared, and that humanity could use the Council's arbitration process, which would only take 3 to 5 years. And Daniel laughed at that, because 3 to 5 years meant thousands of humans would die in those camps, and Velthorn didn't care about that at all. And the arbiter started talking about maintaining diplomatic decorum. But Daniel was done with decorum, and he was done with this entire broken system. He turned to face the whole council, and he told them that humanity had joined because they believed in peace and civilized behavior, and they had given up their right to defend themselves immediately because they trusted this institution to protect them, and that trust had been betrayed, and the Crithians had violated every principle the council stood for, and they did it because they thought there would be no consequences. And Daniel's voice rose as he spoke, and delegates from every species watched him with expressions ranging from sympathy to fear. Velthorn interrupted to say that humanity was too emotional and too young, and that they needed the Council's guidance to mature as a species, and Daniel pulled out a data chip from his jacket, and he held it up for everyone to see, and he explained that it contained every communication from New Haven during the attack, and every scream, and every plea for help, and every final message from parents to children, and humanity's long-range sensors had recorded 6 hours of horror, and Daniel had listened to all of it, and his hand shook as he spoke. He told the council about Gregory Sanders, who held a door for 14 minutes so 30 children could escape, and the man died buying them time, and he told them about Patricia Cole, who was 73 years old and kept transmitting the distress signal for 2 hours while enemy troops broke into her shelter, and he told them about Sophie Chen, who was 8 years old and sang her baby brother to sleep while they hid from soldiers, and she kept singing even when the soldiers found them. And Daniel's voice cracked as he spoke these names, and the chamber had gone completely silent. Daniel looked at Velthorn and told him not to lecture humanity about maturity and not to justify what his people had done, because humanity remembered everything and they would never forget New Haven, and Velthorn tried to dismiss this as empty threats, and he reminded Daniel that humanity was bound by council laws and couldn't act without authorization. And that's when Daniel said the two words that would start a war. He announced that humanity was withdrawing from the Galactic Council effective immediately, and he threw the official withdrawal document onto the chamber floor, and he said that humanity no longer recognized the Council's authority or its laws, and they were invoking their sovereign right to defend their people by any means necessary. And the Arbiter flared bright with alarm and said that Daniel couldn't make that decision without government approval, and Lisa quietly confirmed that Earth had already transmitted the authorization code 30 minutes ago. Daniel turned back to Velthorn one last time, and he told the Crithian that he wanted to see what happened when humanity got angry. He said that the Crithians were about to learn why humans fought 3 world wars on their own planet and still survived, and why they went from wooden ships to faster-than-light travel in 600 years, and why every predator on Earth learned to fear the hairless apes with clever hands, and his voice was cold and hard like steel. He leaned close to the platform's edge and told Velthorn that humanity was going to New Haven to take their people back, and if the Crithians stood in their way, then humanity would show them what humans do to slavers. And then Daniel Harper turned and walked out of the council chamber while delegates screamed and argued behind him, and the Arbiter pulsed with desperate light trying to restore order, and Velthorn stood frozen, perhaps finally understanding what he had unleashed. Lisa hurried after Daniel in the corridor outside, and she caught up to him and asked if he realized what he had just done. And she said they had started a real war, and the Crithian Empire had allies and defensive treaties, and this could spread across the entire sector, and her voice shook as she spoke, and Daniel stopped walking and his hands were trembling from the adrenaline finally hitting him. He told Lisa that he knew exactly what he had done, and that he had probably just killed millions or billions of people. But he couldn't sit in that chamber one more second and pretend that talking would fix this, and the people of New Haven had trusted Earth to protect them. And Earth had failed, and now there was only one thing left to do, which was to show the galaxy that humanity protected its own, no matter what the cost. They walked to their shuttle, and neither of them noticed the recording device attached to Daniel's collar that had transmitted every word back to Earth. It was being broadcast across every human colony and military base and civilian news. Channel and humanity heard their diplomats rage, and they were answering with rage of their own, and the war had begun. Admiral Jacob Stone stood in the command center of the battleship, valiant, and watched ship after ship drop out of faster-than-light travel, and each one appeared on his holographic display as a bright blue marker, and the numbers kept growing and growing until the space around his flagship looked like a constellation of human warships. And Jacob was 63 years old, and he had hoped to retire without seeing another real war, but Daniel Harper's speech had changed everything, and now every ship in the human fleet was gathering for the largest military operation in their history. The numbers on his screen showed 347 capital ships and 812 destroyers and frigates, and 2,000 smaller craft, and more ships were arriving every hour, and Jacob watched them all assemble into formation, and he felt proud and terrified at the same time, because he knew that many of these ships would not return from what they were about to do. And Commander Kyle Davis called out from the tactical station to report that the Roosevelt battle group had just arrived, which brought them to full strength for the first wave. Jacob nodded and turned to Captain Nicole Foster, who was reviewing intelligence reports about New Haven, and she told him that the Crithians had fortified the colony with orbital defense platforms and 3 heavy cruisers and a garrison force on the ground, and they were dug in deep, expecting humanity to negotiate or maybe back down. And Jacob said quietly that the Crithians still didn't understand that humans were done talking. And Nicole looked at him with worry in her eyes, because she knew what was coming. A communication request flashed on Jacob's command screen, and he accepted it, and Daniel Harper's face appeared, looking exhausted with dark circles under his eyes, and Daniel said he wanted to address the fleet before they began the operation, and Jacob raised an eyebrow, said this wasn't a political speech and his people already knew why they were here, but Daniel insisted that he needed to look them in the eye, and Jacob thought about it for a moment and then agreed and gave Daniel 5 minutes. The communication channel expanded to broadcast across every ship in the fleet in 60,000. Crew members saw Daniel's face appear on their screens, and he started by saying he wasn't a soldier, but a diplomat, and his job had been to prevent wars, and for 15 years he believed that words could solve any problem, but he had been wrong. And 3 days ago, the Crithians attacked New Haven and killed hundreds and enslaved thousands, and they did it believing humanity would accept it. And they were wrong about that. Daniel's voice got harder as he spoke, and he told the fleet that they were about to fight an enemy who thought humans were weak and who believed that human compassion was a flaw and human restraint was cowardice. But the Crithians were about to learn the truth, which was that humanity wasn't weak because they chose peace, but terrifying because they chose peace despite being very good at war. And he leaned forward, looking directly into the camera. He told them to fight with honor and not become the monsters they were fighting, but also not to show mercy to anyone standing between them and the colonists, and every human life at New Haven depended on their courage and skill and determination. And he said that some of them wouldn't come home and that weight would be on his conscience forever, but he was asking anyway, because those colonists would do the same for them, and humanity never abandoned its own, and the transmission ended. The fleet was silent for a moment, and then responses began rippling across the communication channels. And it wasn't cheers or battle cries, but something quieter and more serious. And Jacob recognized it as acceptance and resolve, and he turned to his bridge crew and opened the fleet-wide tactical channel and began the final status checks, and every system reported green and ready. Jacob gave the order and told the helm to coordinate the fleet jump, and all ships would exit faster than light travel, simultaneously in combat formation, and they were going in hot, and the jump drives built up their characteristic whine and reality, began to bend around the massive fleet, and space-time curved as the ships prepared to punch through to New Haven. The stars twisted and vanished, and for a heartbeat the fleet existed nowhere and everywhere at once. And then they crashed back into normal space, directly above New Haven, with weapons already tracking targets, and the Crithian defenders were caught completely off guard because they had expected a negotiation team or maybe a small show of force, but instead they faced the entire human military, and Jacob didn't hesitate. He ordered all ships to fire at will and told them priority targets were the orbital defense platforms and secondary targets were the enemy cruisers, and he emphasized that they could not fire on the planet's surface unless specifically authorized, because their people were down there, and the battle began with a thunderous exchange of energy weapons and missiles and human. Railguns launched tungsten slugs at incredible speed, and each one carried the kinetic energy of a small nuclear weapon. Laser arrays capable of cutting through capital ship armor locked onto Crithian vessels, and fusion missiles arced across the void, leaving trails of superheated plasma, and the Crithians returned fire desperately because their weapons were powerful and built on technology refined over thousands of years, but they were outnumbered 20-1, and they had never faced human military fury at full strength. One defense platform exploded, torn apart by concentrated fire from 3 human destroyers, and the second platform lasted longer with its shields absorbing hit after hit until a railgun shot punched through and struck its power core, in the explosion lit up the night side of New Haven like a second sun, and Kyle called out that a Crithian cruiser was breaking orbit and trying to run, but Jacob told him to let it go because they were here for the colony, not glory. The third platform fell minutes later, and the remaining Crithian cruiser surrendered rather than face annihilation, and the orbital battle had lasted less than 30 minutes, but the hard part was just beginning, and Jacob transmitted to the ground the forces that they were cleared for landing, and told them to secure the colony and liberate the prisoners and get their people out. Colonel Benjamin Drake watched through his dropship's viewport as the surface of New Haven rushed up to meet them, and he had 40,000 Marines under his command loaded into 200. Could provide, but equipment didn't win wars, because people did. and he opened the battalion channel and told his Marines that their mission was rescue and liberation. He said every colonist at the processing facility was their responsibility, and every second they wasted was another second those people suffered. So they were going to hit fast and hit hard, and they weren't stopping until every one of their people was safe, and the dropship screamed through the atmosphere with retro thrusters firing as they approached the landing zone. Benjamin could see the colony now with its neat streets and buildings surrounded by ugly gray walls of the Crithian processing facility, and smoke rose from several districts where resistance fighters had apparently kept fighting, and the dropships. Doors slammed open as they hit the ground, and Benjamin led his Marines out into the alien landscape with weapons ready and eyes scanning for threats. Around him, 200 other dropships were unloading. Thousands of soldiers who formed up into assault units in a Crithian defense position opened fire from the processing facility's main gate, and Benjamin didn't hesitate, and he ordered his fire teams to suppress that position and flank left, and he led another team straight through the front door. The Crithians had fortified the gate with automated weapons and energy barriers, but human plasma cutters made short work of the barriers in Marine. Rifle fire suppressed the automated defenses, and Benjamin's team pushed through into the facility. Compound and what they found inside made his blood run cold, because the processing facility was exactly what Daniel had said it was, which was a slave camp. The main structure was built like a prison with rows of containment cells stretching for hundreds of meters.
Ow.
And each cell was packed with human colonists, and the Crithians had segregated them by age and physical capability like they were sorting. Cargo and Benjamin opened his command channel and reported that they had breached the perimeter and were beginning rescue operations immediately. He switched channels and reminded all units that their rules of engagement were clear, and any Crithian soldier who surrendered would be taken prisoner, but any who resisted would be neutralized, and he emphasized that there were civilians everywhere. So they needed to watch their fire, and Lieutenant Carlos Martinez led his squad through the eastern cell block using plasma cutters to breach the locks. Each door that opened revealed more hollow-eyed colonists, and some were crying, and some were too traumatized to react, and Carlos kept repeating that they were safe now, and that humanity had come to take them home, and an older woman grabbed his arm and begged him to find her grandson because they had taken the children too. Building 7 and Carlos promised her that they would find every single person. He radioed Benjamin for permission to redirect his squad to Building 7, and Benjamin immediately granted it and told him to take whoever he needed and bring those kids home. And Carlos moved through the facility with 8 other Marines, and they encountered scattered Crithian guards who chose to fight, and each time, the Marines eliminated the threat with cold efficiency. Building 7 turned out to be what the Crithians called a re-education center, which was their term for a place where they broke the spirits of young captives, and Carlos felt sick when they breached the door and found hundreds of children locked in rooms designed to destroy hope, and he immediately called for medical teams. A girl who looked about 10 years old stared at him with empty eyes and asked if he was real because the Crithians had told them no one was coming, and that Earth had forgotten about them, and Carlos knelt down to her level and told her that Earth never forgot, and that they were going to make sure nothing like this ever happened again, and he felt tears burning in his own eyes as he spoke. Outside the processing facility, the fighting intensified as Crithian reinforcements arrived from their regional garrison, and they had underestimated the human response, but they weren't going to give up their prize without a real fight, and Benjamin coordinated the defense from a command post near the main gate, and he called for air support because enemy armor was approaching from the northwest, and he needed close air support on those positions immediately. Human fighters screamed overhead with their weapon systems locked onto the Crithian tanks advancing across the plain, and missiles streaked down and explosions blossomed across the battlefield, but the Crithians kept coming with their formation, tightening as they pushed toward the facility, and Captain Linda Hayes warned Benjamin that at this rate the enemy would overrun them before they could evacuate all the civilians. Benjamin made a decision that he knew would haunt him for the rest of his life, and he ordered all Marines to form a defensive perimeter and told them they would hold this position no matter what, and the civilians would get out first, and they would leave last. And Linda started to protest because that was suicide if the Crithians brought up heavy reinforcements. But Benjamin cut her off and told her to execute the order. The Marines of the 3rd Division formed a wall of flesh and metal between the advancing Crythians and the freed colonists being loaded onto dropships, and they fought with desperate courage, knowing that every minute they held was another shuttle. Full of civilians reaching safety in Private Andrew Cole crouched behind a makeshift barricade with his rifle overheating from sustained fire. Next to him, Private Helen Carter called out targets with her voice steady despite the chaos around them, and Andrew shouted that he was reloading and ejected his spent power cell and slammed in a fresh one, and Helen told him there were 12 shuttles still on the ground and maybe 20 minutes until full evacuation, and Andrew thought 20 minutes might as well be 20 hours. The Crithians pressed from 3 sides, now with their numbers growing as more units arrived and the human defensive line was buckling with Marines, falling back step by step and yielding ground to buy time, and then the sky lit up with new arrivals. And the naval fleet in orbit had deployed their reserves, sending down every dropship and transport they could spare. Heavy dropships equipped with artillery systems landed behind the Marine lines and their guns elevated toward the enemy positions. And the first volley was devastating and caught the Crithian advance in a storm of high explosive shells, and the second volley was even worse and targeted their command vehicles and supply lines, and Benjamin transmitted to all units that reinforcements had arrived and told them to push the enemy back. The tide turned, and with fresh troops and heavy weapons, the Marines went from desperately defending to actively attacking, and the Crithian forces, already disorganized by the artillery barrage, began to collapse, and within the hour, the enemy was in full retreat, leaving hundreds of their dead scattered across the battlefield, and the Marines had held, and the civilians were safe. Benjamin walked through the aftermath, checking on his troops and the freed colonists, and the costs had been steep, with 43 Marines killed and to over 100 wounded, but they had saved nearly 40,000 civilians from a fate worse than death, and he found Carlos helping load the last of the children onto a medical transport. The lieutenant looked exhausted with his uniform scorched and blood-stained, but he managed a weary smile and told Benjamin that every kid was accounted for, and Benjamin gripped his shoulder and said they had all done good work here. And as the final transports lifted off from New Haven, carrying the freed colonists to the safety of the fleet above, Benjamin allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. They had won this battle, but the war was far from over, and on the bridge of the valiant Admiral Jacob, Stone watched the rescue operation complete with grim satisfaction, because all the colonists were safe and New Haven was back under human control. But intelligence reports were flooding in, and they painted a troubling picture. The Crithian Empire was mobilizing its full military strength, and their allied species were invoking mutual defense treaties, and the Galactic Council was issuing ultimatums and threatening sanctions, and most concerning of all, the long-range sensors had detected a massive Crithian fleet assembling in their core systems. This wasn't just a border war anymore, and this was total war on a scale the galaxy hadn't seen in centuries, and humanity had just fired the opening shots, and Jacob opened a secure channel to Earth Command and reported that New Haven was secure, with all colonists recovered, but they needed to talk about the strategic situation because the Crithians weren't going to let this stand. The response from Earth was swift and uncompromising, and they told Jacob to hold his position because they were sending everything they had, and if the Crythians wanted a war, then humanity would give them a war they would never forget. And Jacob looked out at the stars and at the vast darkness between worlds where fleets were even now moving into position. Somewhere out there, the Crethians were planning their revenge, and humanity was preparing to meet them with fire and steel, and the real war was about to begin. And back on Earth, Daniel Harper watched the battle reports with mixed emotions, because they had won, but at such terrible cost and so many lives lost, and all of it traced back to his decision to withdraw from the council. Victoria Lang found him standing at a window overlooking Geneva with the lights of the city spreading below, and she told him quietly that he had done the right thing, and Daniel asked if he had, because 20,000 people died today, and how many more would die before this ended, and Victoria replied that fewer would die than if they had let the Crithians think they could prey on humanity with impunity. She said that Daniel had made the hard choice that no one else was willing to make, and he turned to face her and asked what would happen after they won, assuming they did win, because the galaxy would never trust Humanity again, and every species, would see them as warmongers, as the ones who broke the peace. Victoria admitted that some would, but others would remember that humanity fought to protect their people, and that they didn't start this war, but they finished it, and species would think twice before threatening human colonies in the future. And she handed him a datapad with messages from the council saying they wanted to negotiate and offering to mediate a peace settlement. Daniel read through the proposals, and they were reasonable with terms that both sides could accept, including the Crithians withdrawing their territorial claims in humanity, accepting council oversight on future military actions and prisoners being exchanged, and reparations being paid, and Victoria asked what he thought. Daniel said he thought they should hear the council out, but on human terms, and they would meet at a neutral location, not at the council station, and they wouldn't agree to anything that limited their ability to defend their people. And Victoria nodded and said she would set it up, but Daniel needed to know that the council would want him there, because he was the face of this war, whether he liked it or not. He looked back out at the city lights, thinking about all the people down there who were celebrating the victory, and they saw him as a hero, as the diplomat who finally stood up to bullies, but they didn't see the nightmares that kept him awake, or the faces of all those who had died because of his words. And he told Victoria that he would go, because if it meant ending this war, he would face them. Meanwhile, in the Crithian home system, Fleet Commander Zarthel received reports of the disaster at New Haven, and his mandibles clicked with rage because the humans had humiliated the Empire and destroyed their garrison and killed hundreds of Crithian soldiers and rescued all the prisoners, and the Emperor was demanding blood, and Zarthel was assembling the largest fleet in Crithian history. 800 capital ships were gathering in orbit above the Crithian homeworld, and thousands of support vessels were loading weapons and supplies, and fighter squadrons were drilling constantly, and Zarthel studied tactical reports about human fleet capabilities, and he noted their unconventional tactics and their aggressive command style, but he had thousands of years of Crithian military tradition behind him. The humans had won one battle through surprise and overwhelming numbers, but now the Crithians would show them what real military power looked like. And Zarthel planned to crush the human fleet and then systematically destroy every human colony, until Earth itself begged for mercy. And his officers listened to his plans with approval, because the Empire had never lost a war. They would not start losing now, and the Crithian fleet would launch within the week, and their target was the human forward base at the edge of Crithian space, and Zarthel intended to destroy it completely, and send a message that would echo across the galaxy, which was that no one challenged the Crithian Empire and survived. But what Zarthel didn't understand was that humanity had spent their entire evolutionary history as persistence hunters, and they didn't know how to quit, and they didn't know how to surrender, and every setback just made them angrier and more determined, and the Crithians were about to learn that lesson the hard way. Because when you threaten a human's family, you don't just make an enemy, you make an enemy who will never stop coming for you. The Crithian fleet assembled at the edge of their territory, like a storm gathering strength. And Fleet Commander Zarthel stood on the bridge of his flagship, Dominion, watching the tactical display as his 800 capital ships formed into battle formation, and he had never commanded such a massive force, and the weight of the Empire's expectations pressed down on him, but he welcomed it, because this was what Crithians were born to do. His second officer reported that all ships were ready and weapons systems were charged, and fighter wings were prepared for launch, and Zarthel clicked his mandibles in satisfaction and ordered the fleet to advance toward the human forward base. At the system they called the Crithian Gate, and the massive fleet jumped too faster than light travel, and reality bent around them as they crossed the void. The human base? At Crithian Gate was a fortified station surrounded by defense platforms and minefields, and a defensive fleet that intelligence said numbered around 400 capital ships in Crithion. Knew the humans would fight hard because that was their nature, but numbers would tell in the end, and the Crithians had both numbers and experience on their side. Admiral Jacob Stone received the alert that a massive Crithian fleet was inbound, and he had been expecting this ever since New Haven, but the size of the enemy force still made his stomach clench, and he called his senior officers to the command center, and they gathered around the tactical display showing the approaching red markers. Commander Kyle Davis reported that long-range sensors counted at least 800 Crithian capital ships plus thousands of support craft, and the enemy was advancing in traditional formation with heavy ships at center and screening forces. The flanks and Jacob studied the display carefully because he had been fighting simulated battles against Crithian tactics for 30 years, and he knew their playbook. Captain Nicole Foster asked if they should fall back and consolidate with the reserve fleets, but Jacob shook his head and said they would hold here, because if they gave ground now, the Crithians would gain momentum, and they needed to stop them. Colden showed the galaxy that humanity wasn't afraid, and Nicole looked worried, but she nodded. Jacob opened a channel to all ships in the fleet and told them that the Crithians were coming with everything they had. And this would be the largest space battle in galactic history, and every person on every ship knew what was at stake, and they were fighting not just for themselves, but for every human colony and every child who needed to sleep safely at night, and he told them to make humanity proud. The human fleet formed up in what looked like a standard defensive formation, but Jacob had other plans, and he had studied the recordings from New Haven and analyzed how the Crithians responded to threats, and he knew they expected humans to fight like everyone else, but humans didn't fight like everyone else, and that was going to be their advantage. The Crithian fleet dropped out of faster than light travel at the edge of weapons range, and Zarthel immediately began his advance, and he kept his heavy ships together in a massive wedge formation designed to punch through any defense in his screening forces spread wide to prevent flanking maneuvers, and it was a formation that had won 1,000 battles. Jacob watched the enemy advance and waited until they were fully committed, and then he gave the order, and the human fleet suddenly broke apart with smaller groups peeling away, and what looked like chaos and destroyer squadrons accelerated at angles that seemed random, and frigates burned hard for the flanks, and the capital ships appeared to be falling back. On the Dominion, Zarthel watched the human formation dissolve, and his mandibles clicked with satisfaction, and he told his officers that the humans were panicking already to maintain course because they would sweep the defenders aside like debris, and his officers echoed his confidence because no one had ever defeated a Crithian main fleet. But as the range closed, the human ships suddenly revealed their true positions, and the chaos had been carefully choreographed in fast attack. Squadrons were now at perfect angles to strike the Crithian flanks while the capital ships maintained firing solutions on the enemy center, and Jacob gave the final order and told all ships to fire with everything. The void erupted in fire, and human railguns hurled tungsten slugs at speeds that made them hit like nuclear weapons, and laser arrays carved through shields and armor and missiles swarmed across the space between fleets and their fusion warheads turned Crithian ships into expanding clouds of plasma and debris, and the Crithians returned fire, but they were fighting a new kind of warfare. Their particle beams could vaporize a frigate in seconds, and their graviton torpedoes could crush a destroyer like paper, but the human ships were moving in unpredictable patterns and refusing to engage in the kind of traditional battle that expected, and Lieutenant Sarah Kim piloted her fighter through the chaos with her squadron hunting Crithian bombers. Her targeting system locked onto an enemy craft, and she fired, and her plasma cannons reduced it to a brief flash of light, and she called to her squadron to form on her because there were more enemy fighters at high closing speed, and the fighters danced through the battle, too small for capital ship weapons to track and too numerous for enemy fighters to intercept. On the Valiant, Kyle called out damage reports as enemy fire found its mark, and he reported that forward shields were at 60%, and the cruiser Normandy had taken heavy damage and was falling back, and the destroyer line was taking casualties. And they had lost the Stevens and the Martinez, and Jacob felt each loss like a knife. He ordered them to keep pressure on the Crithian center and not let them reorganize, and the battle raged for hours, with ships dying on both sides and brilliant flashes marking the end of hundreds of lives, and the space around Crithian Gate became a graveyard of shattered hulls and drifting debris. But slowly the tide began to turn, and the human tactics were working, and Crithian ships, designed for traditional fleet engagements, struggled to adapt to the hit-and-run attacks, and their formation began to fragment with ships losing cohesion. as they tried to respond to threats from multiple directions, and Kyle reported that the enemy flagship was exposed. Jacob made the call and told all heavy units to target the Dominion, and he wanted every gun they had on that ship, and fighters were ordered to clear a path, and the human fleet focused its fury on a single point, and dozens of capital ships turned their weapons on the Crithion flagship, and the Dominion's shields blazed as they absorbed hit after hit. Inside the Dominion, Zarthiel watched his bridge explode around him as human fire finally penetrated their defenses and systems failed, and crew members died at their stations. In his last thought before the ship's reactor went critical was surprise, because the humans had fought with a ferocity he never expected, and perhaps the Crithians had underestimated this young species after all. The Dominion exploded in a blast visible across the entire battlefield, and for a moment all firing ceased as both sides witnessed the death of the Crithian flagship, and then the Crithian fleet began to retreat, because without their command ship, and without their leader, their formation collapsed completely, and ships broke away individually, jumping too faster than light as soon as they could charge their drives. Kyle asked if they should pursue, but Jacob shook his head and said to let them go, because they had won the battle and there was no need to turn it into a slaughter, and the human fleet held position battered and bloodied, but victorious, and they had lost 83 ships and over 20,000 crew members, but they had broken the main Crithian fleet. The news of the victory spread across human space like wildfire, and every colony celebrated, and every military base erupted in cheers, and for the first time since the war began, people believed they could actually win, and recruitment centers were overwhelmed with volunteers, and factories worked around the clock building new ships and ammunition. But on Earth, Daniel Harper watched the battle reports with mixed emotions, because they had won, but at such terrible cost and so many lives lost, and all of it traced back to his decision. And Victoria found him at the window again and told him that the Council was serious about peace talks now, because humanity had proven they could stand against any power in the galaxy. She said that Ambassador Belthorn himself had sent a message requesting negotiations, and he was using very different language now, with none of the arrogance from before, and Daniel read the message and saw that the Crithian was proposing a neutral location and reasonable terms, and for the first time he allowed himself to hope that maybe the killing could stop. He told Victoria to accept the meeting, but on their conditions, and they would bring Admiral Jacob Stone and military advisors, because this wouldn't be the old kind of diplomacy, where humans begged for scraps, and this would be negotiation between equals, and the Crithians needed to understand that humanity had earned respect through blood and fire. 2 weeks after the Battle of Crithian, Gate delegates from humanity and the Crithian Empire and a dozen other species gathered at a neutral space station called Haven's Rest, and it was a civilian facility far from any military installations chosen, specifically to emphasize that this was about peace, not continued war. And Daniel Harper walked into the conference chamber, flanked by Victoria Lang and Admiral Walt Jacob Stone. Across the room, Ambassador Velthorn watched them with his multifaceted eyes, and Daniel noticed that the Crithian's mandibles weren't clicking with their usual arrogance in the alien. Diplomat looked smaller somehow, as if defeat had diminished him physically, and the Arbiter pulsed in the center of the chamber with its energy form shifting through colors. The Arbiter spoke, and its translated voice filled the room, saying they had gathered to end the war between humanity and the Crithian Empire, and both sides had demonstrated their military capabilities, and both sides had suffered losses, and it was time to find a path to peace. And Daniel took his seat at the human delegations table and prepared himself for what he knew would be difficult negotiations. The talks lasted 3 days, and they were painful discussions where every point was Conti stead and every word scrutinized, because the Crithians wanted to save face and avoid appearing defeated, while humanity wanted guarantees that nothing like New Haven would ever happen again, and Velthorn proposed that the Crithians would release prisoners and pay modest reparations if humanity withdrew their fleets immediately. Daniel rejected that immediately, and said the reparations needed to be substantial enough to rebuild New Haven completely, and to compensate every family for their suffering and resources. Belthorn clicked in protest, saying that amount would cripple the Crithian economy, and Daniel replied coldly that the Crithian economy should have thought about that before attacking civilians. Victoria presented evidence of everything the Crithians had done at New Haven, including testimony from freed colonists and medical reports. showing malnutrition and abuse and psychological trauma. And she laid it all out methodically, and by the end, even some of the neutral delegates were looking at Velthorn with disgust, and the Arbiter pulsed with what might have been disapproval. Admiral Jacob Stone spoke about the military situation, and he made it clear that while humanity preferred peace, they were fully prepared to continue the war in human shipyards, or building new vessels faster than the Crithians could replace. Their losses in human recruitment was at an all-time high, while Crithian allies were quietly reconsidering their treaty obligations. The second day focused on territorial claims, and the Crithians finally withdrew all claims to New Haven and any other human colony, and they agreed to establish a demilitarized zone along their border with human space, and both sides would reduce their military presence in that area, and Jacob nodded at this because it gave humanity breathing room to consolidate their defenses. On the third day, they discussed the release of prisoners, and the Crithians initially claimed they only held 5,000 humans. But Daniel presented intelligence showing the real number was closer to 12,000 because the Crithians had been taking humans from New Haven to various facilities across their empire, and Velthorn finally admitted this was true. Daniel demanded the immediate release and safe return of every single human prisoner with full medical care and transportation provided by the Crithian government, and Velthorn agreed but tried to negotiate for the return of Crithian military. Prisoners taken at New Haven, and Daniel said they would exchange prisoners simultaneously at a neutral location with council observers present. Then Daniel introduced the clause that would change everything, and he said that any species that attacks civilian populations of a council member would face mandatory military intervention, and the council would not simply mediate but would act, and would protect the weak from the strong with force if necessary. And Velthorn's mandibles clicked sharply in protest. The Crithian ambassador said that would turn the council into a military force, and that went against everything it was founded on. But Daniel replied that it fulfilled everything the council was founded on because the council was created to prevent wars, but prevention only worked if aggressors knew there would be consequences. The Arbiter pulsed thoughtfully and said the human proposal had merit and suggested a council defense force that would be activated only in cases of clear aggression against civilian populations and would require approval from 2/3 of the SCH council membership before deployment, and several smaller species immediately voiced their support. The delegates from the Merchant Confederacy and the Saurian Concordat both agreed, because they had always feared being victims of larger empires, and this proposal would protect them, and even some of the larger powers agreed, seeing the wisdom in a system that would protect all members equally, and Velthorn stood in silence for a long moment. Finally, the Crithian ambassador's mandibles clicked in what might have been resignation, and he said the Crithian Empire would accept these terms, and the war was ended, and the chamber erupted in relieved conversation, and the Arbiter pulsed bright with satisfaction, and Daniel felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight since the day he walked out of the council. The treaty was signed that evening with representatives from every major species in the galaxy as witnesses, and humanity rejoined the Galactic Council, but on new terms as equals rather than supplicants, and the war had lasted 3 months and cost humanity 43,000 military personnel and nearly 800 civilians. The Crithians had lost over 200,000, with their fleet shattered and their economy crippled by war expenses, and their reputation as an invincible military power destroyed forever, and more importantly, the galaxy's perception of humanity had changed completely, and they were no longer seen as weak or naive, but as a power to be respected. Daniel returned to Earth exhausted but relieved, and he resumed his diplomatic duties with a new understanding of the limits of words and the necessity of strength, and he would spend the rest of his career working to prevent future wars. But he never forgot the lesson of New Haven, which was that sometimes peace required the willingness to fight. Admiral Jacob Stone received a promotion in command of the new council defense force, and his first task was to establish protocols for intervention and training programs for mixed species military units, and he took the job seriously because he knew that the galaxy was watching to see if humanity could be trusted with this responsibility. The freed colonists from New Haven were transported home on human ships, and they received full medical care and psychological counseling. and the colony was rebuilt with funds from Crithian reparations, and within a year, New Haven was thriving. Again, and new colonists were arriving to replace those who chose to return to Earth. 3 years after the war ended, Daniel stood at a memorial on New Haven, and the monument listed the names of everyone who died during the occupation and the liberation, and among them were Gregory Sanders, who held the door, and Patricia Cole, who kept transmitting, and Sophie Chen, who sang to her brother, and Daniel placed a flower at the base. Behind him, the colony bustled with life, and children played in the streets, and families gathered in parks, and businesses thrived, and New Haven had survived its darkest hour and emerged stronger, and it was a reminder that humanity's greatest strength wasn't their weapons or their ships, but their refusal to give up. Daniel thought about everything that had happened and all the choices he had made, and he knew that historians would debate for generations whether he had done the right thing, and some would call him a hero and others would call him a warmonger, and he didn't know which was true, and maybe both were. But standing there at the memorial, surrounded by the sounds of a living, thriving colony, he knew one thing for certain, which was that every person whose name was carved into that stone had died protecting others, and their sacrifice had meaning. Because New Haven lived and humanity was stronger and the galaxy was safer, Victoria joined him at the memorial, and they stood in silence for a while, and then she said that the council had just approved another protection clause, and any species that practiced slavery would face immediate sanctions and possible military action, and it was being called the New Haven Protocol, and Daniel smiled slightly at that. He said that maybe some good had come from all the horror, and maybe the galaxy really would be different now, and Victoria nodded, and said that humanity had proven something important, which was that peaceful species could still be dangerous when threatened, and that bullies needed to learn that compassion wasn't weakness. They walked back through the colony together, and everywhere Daniel looked, he saw families who had been given a second chance at life and children who would grow up free and safe, and he thought about the 8-year-old girl Sophie who had sung in the darkness, and how she was 15 now and planning to study medicine. The war had ended, but its effects would echo through the galaxy for generations, and humanity had earned their place among the stars, not through conquest or domination, but through the willingness to fight what was right and to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. And the galaxy remembered. On distant worlds, young Crithians learned a new lesson in their history. Classes about the war they lost, and about the species that refused to surrender, and some of them looked at humanity with hatred, but others looked with respect and understood. That strength came in many forms, and the strongest warrior wasn't always the one who won every battle. Daniel Harper returned to his office in Geneva and resumed his quiet work of diplomacy and negotiation and peace-building. And the galaxy had changed, and humanity had changed, and he had changed, but one thing remained constant, which was that humans would always protect their own, and they would never forget, and they would never stop fighting for those who needed them, and that was what made them truly terrifying and truly magnificent.